let's move on to qualitative analysis. And I think this is where the fun is. I said advisably, which again says more about me than anybody else in the room. Qualitative data, I am a quali. It's soft data, to remind ourselves. There's no statistics in it. So we don't try and ascribe any statistical value, except, as I said before, when we present the themes, to provide in brackets or in some way the number of responses that go up to make that theme. Okay, that doesn't validate or devalidate any of the themes that you generate. It just shows the frequency and, if a way, an expression of the emotion that's associated with that theme. Okay, so it's not really a statistical presentation. It's more of a representation of the strength of feeling that goes behind that. It's very rich, and that's where the fun is. Because when we come to theme this, what we've got to work through as analysts is what it is that the individuals are trying to say to us. What is the Judy, you might say, I think this is the best thing since sliced bread. And Ros might say, and you would never say this, by the way, I think this is pants, you know. So I am putting words in both of your mouths there. But you know, those are very different, very subjective views around it, but it's very clear what the message is behind those things. It's very, very strongly in support, very strongly against. Okay, so that feels it. But what we'll start to see is those polar views. We'll see themes coming through that reflect that, but don't necessarily use those same things. So we'll start to bring them together. So there's a richness around it. And the way that we collect that is through focus groups, interviews, deliberative events, letters, emails, working groups, social media, video booths, online forum, free text in our survey, all of those things, all of the good stuff that we do around that. So we know that we've got a lot of events around that. We know that we're going to stand outside Morrison's, Sainsbury's, Tesco's and ask people that are coming in to do that. We know that I think my favourite was on T-Bay Services on the M6, which is always worth a stop. Not a plug, yeah, but it's always worth a stop. Fire and Rescue Service there opened up at the trailer with the sides open, giving away stuff and asking opinions there. Really good. That's the kind of stuff that's going to happen. That's neither an endorsement of either T-Bay Services or the relevant Fire and Rescue Service, by the way. It's just something that happened to me. We do all of that kind of stuff. It brings it in loads of rich context around it. The challenge is, by the way, in doing things like drop-ins at supermarkets or putting stuff at trailers in service stations, or using the other one you see very much as a VW camper van, where because people just love to go around those camper vans for some reason. How you collect that data. So it's making sure that the people who are there actually have some form of standardised reporting format. You don't need much. You just need a sheet of A4, which is what the key questions that you're asking and what the sort of responses around that are. We don't want chapter and verse. It'd be lovely if we got it. We don't necessarily want it. We want the key points, but we want them in a standardised format. Too often, people forget about that. I worked with the One Fire and Rescue Service, who'd done a lot of great stuff, great field work. And I said, where's your evidence? This was a quality assurance. They got good practice. They couldn't get best practice because they couldn't evidence the way in which they collected that data around that stuff. So we miss it. Looking at qual data, in the same way we look at quant data, the arrangement of it is the key. This is where it goes wrong. And it particularly goes wrong in qualitative more than quantitative. Because you can generally, I talked about question 4 and question 5, both being rating scores and people putting them out. Generally that doesn't happen. It can happen, and I've seen it happen, but generally because the way it's squirted out into an Excel spreadsheet in effect. It's usually comma separated value spreadsheet that you convert into Excel, but we're getting technical there, aren't we? So it comes into Excel and they come into predefined columns. it's worth checking to make sure that the system hasn't made there has been no system errors in the export. But apart from that, generally runs on Rails. Qual data should come out in the same way, but sometimes doesn't. Or it's very easy to confuse the different types of data. So you get, when you come into theme the stuff, and that's that point about arranging your data systematically, don't put it all into one file. Don't put it all into, assume that because it's all qualitative, we can put it all together and we can analyse it, because it's responses to different questions. So the simple thing is to make sure that it will, out of, I'm using the online stuff because it's easier, it will come out of your system and it'll come out squirted into the right columns. Check that that's right, but never merge the columns. And that happens. And people try to develop themes out of that data, or try to analyse that data, when we've actually conflated 2 questions, or 3 questions, or all of the questions. And the worst I've seen is where they merged all of them together, because it's all of our soft text data. And we'll just develop the themes from that. How can you make sense of that? You know, because you've got comments that relate to completely different things. You can probably theme them, but then you'll start to see that you'll see polarization of themes, you'll see massive differences of themes, and it becomes really frustrating. And the other thing is, you got a humongous amount of data. So we talk about analysis paralysis in the presentation stuff. For an analyst, if you've got this huge data sets, I mean, if you've got 1,000 responses and you've got 5 text questions, 3 open text questions, that's 5,000, potentially 5,000, not everybody answers them. That's 5,000 discrete responses that you've got to analyse and pull them together into themes. So you've made your job really difficult. So sensibly organise it, put into a way that's structured, but it's going to come out largely unstructured. It's going to come out in a way that you kind of can't work through. Ensure that you've got it, put it into systematic arrangements. And that will include, if you've done focus groups, ensuring that all of that information is transcribed. So when you're doing a focus group, it's a bit different to the example that we talked about before, where we've got frontline staff who are having conversations. In a focus group, you'll conduct it around a semi-directive script. So it's a series of prompts that will reflect the topics that you're talking about, and you make sure that you cover all of those. Before you go into that, before you start the focus group, always ask permission to record it. So take an audio recording. Standard stuff, GDPR, data protection, requires you to do that anyway. But if you are, like me, a member of the Market Research Society, before all of that stuff, that was your guidelines anyway. You always ask permission. It's informed consent to participate in research all the time. But anyway, it's now codified in law, so you're breaking the law if you don't ask that question, which makes it more difficult. Get that transcribed. Just make sure that you turn your audio into words, and then you can start to work through that. Get it all sorted out. Organise that into the questions, so you're getting it sorted out, and set up a coding framework. And what that means is that when you look at this, you're going to identify codes. The codes are different from the frame, the thematic framework. The coding frame is different from your themes. They're your initial cut. People get confused, and I've got a nice illustration and some technical descriptions of why you do that. But people get confused between coding and theming. So coding is where you pull together and you start to look where it comes, where it works. So you start to make that first cut. Validate your data. Always go back and validate it. Accuracy and reliability are key. And the one thing that I'll say, analysis is not a solo sport. It's always a team sport. Qualitative data analysis is in particular not to be done solo, because the majority of the analysis is subjective. And if you just do it from your perspective, you impose your biases. It's always better done in a group. The more people you can get involved in it, the better. Don't create a committee though.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're all laughing. And the reason we're all laughing is because we've been involved in those situations where we've created data analysis committees and it doesn't work. Sorry. You want a group. The same principles we talked about in a reading circle. You want a relatively constrained group, but you need to bring different perspectives into that because it is very subjective. So what my coding is like is going to be different for Louise's, it's going to be different from Mandy's, Dave's, Judy's, Roz's, Paquita's. We're all going to have we're going to take it. We'll get the core of it the same, but there will be differences. And what we need to do is get a moderated consensus around that. So validate your data, ensure you go and then report it. The tools to help you, Excel again. Excel's just an all-rounder. It's available. And the reason for that is it's very useful for creating coding frames. And I'll go into that data and show you how to do that as well as we go through that. Or we use specialist QDA software, which is qualitative data analysis software. So the example we've put up is NVivo, only because that's generally the most commonly used software, but it's not the only one. So it's not a recommendation for the institute that you should use NVivo. They don't code for you though. Even the QDA analysis software does not do the coding for you. It will maybe come up with a first cut. It'll go through that, but it needs human intervention to work through that. So you've still got to move it around. Excel's great in that because you can just cut and move the themes between tabs, cut it out, move it around, and start to see the patterns that come through. So it's very flexible, and I'll show you how to do that. But it's not the be-all and end-all. I'm old enough to remember when you did qualitative analysis, when they were typed up for you, and you had a printout, and you'd cut out the individual statements, and then you'd do your theming on tables or only just old enough, I have to say, but nonetheless, it is in living memory doing it, things like that. And also SPSS, I'm going back to the quantitative stuff, where you used to have to turn the SPSS room on, which was probably bigger than this room, and leave it overnight to see what results it would turn out. And if you'd made a mistake, that was frustrating because you had to do it all again and wait another 24 hours for it anyway. It's slightly exaggerating, but it didn't happen anywhere near because software used to come on dinner plates and all that sort of stuff. So it's, you can do all sorts of ways of doing this, even down to just getting a printout, using highlighters, marker pens, post-it notes, all of that sort of stuff. It's a very, very tactile way of coding. But it's also important to tell you the things that qualitative data is, or what it doesn't do. I've said it before, but it needs to be reinforced because people always ask you, what is the statistical significance, or how representative is your focus group, your qualitative data? It's not, because it's not statistical. You can make it representative in the way that you recruit the focus groups or those things. So if we want to reach into, I don't like the term, but the way people are described as hard to reach groups. That's not true, by the way. It's actually us that are we're hard to hear. We're the barrier, not those groups. It's about we're not trying hard enough, or we're turning up in our suits or whatever. But anyway, you can make it representative by ensuring that we have groups with minority ethnic groups. We'll go for any of the protected characteristics. Not going to list them all off, except for marriage. Doesn't that one as a protected characteristic doesn't apply in consultation and engagement? We don't need to look at that one. That doesn't mean you don't have to, but you're not going to get a failure of your duty. So it's not statistical. It never is. It's not linear. So it's all over the place. You don't think that there's no progression. It's not statistical. It's really important. It's not independent of human cognition. It's a fancy way of saying is that we have our own preconceptions and bias. So we need to make sure that we get around it. Leads on to the fact that it's not best analysed alone. It's not best analysed alone. It's not a very good sentence, that, is it? But anyway, it's not a solo sport. Always work in a team. And this will always trip you up when you're looking at qualitative data. It's not always easily broken down into single responses. So your qualitative data, when you get it, people will make clauses and sub-clauses in their statements, and they refer to different things. So that part of that statement may apply in one theme, but it also applies in another one. So don't just think that because that's why you need to read and reread that data to ensure that you're getting as full a representation of the richness of it. The 4 stages approach to qualitative analysis. This is counterintuitive and counter to human nature, but this is the best way of getting through your qualitative analysis. So this is a 4-stage approach which was developed by Professor Alan Bryman, who I use this quote about validity, one of the leading UK, used to be a professor in Leicester University, sadly passed away, but he's developed this approach. And it's that simple. It really is simple, but it's really hard to implement. First stage is read the data, which is not about ascribing any values. Just read it through. Make notes around it, but just read it through. Then read it again, reread the text. So then you can start doing the markup when you're starting to see commonality around it. That's the hardest part of this, because you'll start to get into your qual data, you'll read it, and you'll start to develop codes straight away. You'll start to theme it. Oh, that goes with that, that goes with that, that goes with that. Oh, I can see the links to that. No. Discipline, because you get false coding that way. You start to leap, you make assumptions. One of my professor colleagues used to call it heroic leaps of faith. And I always used to say, well, that does not lead to errors, but we never agreed on that. We never settled that argument. Read it again, then you start to mark it up. Then you go into the code. Group it by your observations. So that's why the codes are different to your themes. And the final step is refine the developed codes and group them into representative themes. So you look at that. So as you're coding, you'll find that sometimes some of them will go together. You'll see that there's commonalities and bring them together. And sometimes they get too big and you'll start to see that you need to split them out. When you get into thematic analysis, you bring the codes, you start to break the codes down.